It keeps changing on its own. The slides.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's weird.
I put it on pause as well, so it's not even running.
Can I borrow this one?
Oh, yeah.
We have a bit of issues with the sound, so just give me a couple minutes until I tell you. Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. This doesn't work. Okay. Hello, everybody. Since this doesn't work for in-person audience, I've been told. Welcome to the session. I know you had choices for other sessions, so as the airlines would say, thank you for flying with us. We'll try and make this session worth your while, present you with a lot of information and these stellar cast of speakers. So why result-based financing? Why did we thought this session was interesting? I mean, all of you know half the population in the world still doesn't have access to safely managed services. Governments have enough of other agenda items to look at, and therefore we need alternative mechanism of financing for sanitation. And that's why result-based financing. What we'll try and do today is give you an overview of what result-based financing is. So Lewis Boston will take that into consideration and present an overview of result-based financing and various mechanisms. Paul Gunsenson, who's at your far right, the gentleman in far right, is going to talk about the social impact bond experience in Cambodia. He is representing Stone Family Foundation. Then we will have Lindsay Stradley talk about the performance-based contract in Nairobi. She's a co-founder at Synergy. And we will have finally, last but not the least, Miguel Vargas Ramirez, who will talk about performance-based loans. So the way we are planning to run these sessions is that we 10-minute presentations. So please hold on to your questions if you have any on clarification. We'll take all of them at the end of the 4 presentations to not break the flow. We will have a brief, I promise it'll be brief panel discussion where there'll be like 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll open it up to the room so that you can ask questions. And I'm sure your questions will be far more interesting than mine anyways. So I'll try and give you more time than I take on this. So without much further ado, I'll hand it over to Lewis.
So let's start out with who I'm not. I'm not the person who was originally supposed to give this presentation, who organized the session, actually Jan Willem Rosenboom, a former colleague of mine from the Gates Foundation. Anybody who knows him knows those are very large shoes to fill, being about 6'9" tall. So I'm really going to work. And I think the second choice was Rob Mills from social finance, but he's not here. So you guys are stuck with me. I do know a little bit about finance and about sanitation, so I think I can manage this. The point of my presentation is to help folks who are not finance experts come to a basic understanding of what results-based finance means. If I do that, I've done my job. If those of you who are experts on finance are bored, I'm sorry. You know, just hang out for 5 minutes or so and we'll get on to the deeper presentation. So I put up the logical framework or log frame here because this is the way a lot of people think about how things get done in the development business. There will not be a quiz on this later, but the important part of it is this, that the usual funding approach in the development world is you pay your money, you take your chances. The money goes in up front, and then you got to hope that all those other parts work so that you get to the outcomes and impacts that you want. The idea of results-based finance is really pretty basic. Instead of paying there, you pay there. And the idea is if your money goes there, then you're paying for what you actually want to get. Hold on to that. That's really the most complicated thing we're going to be doing here. So why would you want to consider results-based finance? There are a few of these. This is courtesy of my friends at Social Finance. The results-based finance obviously gives you the opportunity to pay for what you want and to hold the people who are delivering the services accountable for those results. It helps you also to make sure that the incentives and the performance is very clearly shared and understood. You can't have one of these agreements unless you've actually sat there and negotiated on what you want to have as the outcomes, because that's what you're going to pay for. There is some degree of flexibility to change the implementation approach because you're not getting paid for what you're doing. You're getting paid, well, you're getting paid for the outcome of what you're doing, not how you get there. We will get into a little bit later whether that means there's actual innovation in this process, but there's certainly flexibility. It is much easier to do this if you have good data. In fact, you have to have good data. And you not only have to have good data, you have to have data that somebody else can verify, because it's not just up to you to say that it happened. An independent party gets to do that. This is definitely an interesting part, which is allocation of risk. There are people, there are organizations that want to pay for the outcomes, but do not want to take the risk of finding out if they're going to get there. There are other folks who are potentially able to take those risks. And if you can divide up the way those risks are allocated, you can end up with a more efficient system, if you will. And finally, you can end up with some different sorts of partnerships that you might not have expected when you started. Sorry for the fuzzy puppy thing. Okay, so the basic mechanics, and those of you who love fuzzy puppies, sorry for that. So the basic mechanics of a results-based finance. It starts out, there are only 4 of these parts of it. So it starts out with a contract with between the funders and the providers, and we'll talk a little bit about what makes for a good contract and what makes for good outcomes. But if you remember anything from all of this, it's that results-based finance mechanisms are contracts. And that means you've got to be, if you want it to work, you've got to be able to deliver. You don't go into a contract saying, gosh, I hope I can do this. You go into a contract saying, I know I can do this. And if you do that and it works, you're going to be a lot happier. Second part of this is the service provider then obviously works with the folks who they're trying to help out and to improve those outcomes. The third part is those outcomes are verified to see if the results are achieved. And for those of you taking notes and stuff, I'm sure we can make the slides available at some point. Don't worry about that. And then finally, we get back to the payment part, where having set up that contract in step 4 in step 1, now we're back at step 4 and you actually get paid. So that is the basics. There is a slightly modified version of this called an impact bond. This is a horrible name. This is not a bond. Anybody who knows anything about finance knows this is not a bond. We can talk about bonds if anybody wants to talk about it, but these aren't bonds. I don't know why they came up with the name. Anyway, the new part is over on the right here, which is that part about folks putting money in up front. The investors put the money in up front, and then they can then that can help kick it off because the service providers may not be able to have the funds on their own. There are several types of results-based financing. Choose your flavor, what you like here. The good news is that 3 of these will be discussed today by folks who have deep experience in them or in developing them. And I'm going to actually just let them talk about these because the useful thing here to capture is they do have different names: performance-based aid, performance-based transfer, contract, impact bonds. But what matters is who are the parties involved. And some of these involve national governments or local governments. Some just involve service providers. But we will get good examples of these, and you will get a better sense of how those work. So when would you want to consider doing this? You can have a complex situation. You need something done like getting a bunch of people sanitation, which is a pretty complex thing to do, but you know exactly what you want, is you want them to get safe sanitation. So if you don't want to sort of go beyond that, you can say, right, I want to pay for these folks to get sanitation, or I want to pay for X hundred tons of shit to be taken out of the environment every day. That's going to be what I want to see. And I'm going to trust you to figure out how to get that done. Another reason to undertake, to use this sort of undertaking is that there is risk involved. And again, it goes back to that point of allocation of risk. Some people don't want to take that risk. They just want to pay if the outcomes are there. So that can help. The need for upfront capital, this is one of the interesting parts. Some of these mechanisms involve providing upfront capital, And some of them expect the service providers to find that capital on their own. And you know, depending on the situation, you may think it's unreasonable to say that you're supposed to deliver on these outcomes, but you're not giving me any money up front. So that there are definitely different ways of doing this, but certainly a number of them, including the impact bond, involves getting money up front to, if not pay for the whole thing, then to pay for at least part of it. And this is back to that point on the flexibility in the implementation. You may not know exactly how you're going to deliver it, but you've got a pretty good idea. Again, I don't think this is a great opportunity for innovation, wholesale innovation, but it's not a bad opportunity to try to have some flexibility. So prerequisites, well, if you're going to be paying for outcomes, you got to be able to measure them. And you got to be able to agree up front on what they are. Yeah, obviously, it's sort of a fool to go into a contract without the ability to deliver on the contract. So the implementer has to have the capacity to do that. It is helpful if this is an area, if you're involving the government or donors, this obviously has to be something they want to see happen. And back to the point on data, you've got to have the data because otherwise you can't arrange the payments. So these last couple of slides, I'm just about done here, are from my friends at the Gates Foundation. They have done several of these, and this is my attempt, hopefully not to really mangle what they've learned, but to share some of their learning. So this first slide is about what make for good outcomes in a contract, measurable and verifiable. And then the point is, again, going back to the log frame, as far down the impact pathway as possible. Usually, in some cases, you can actually pay for impacts, but more often in the sanitation biz, if the impact you're long-term expecting is something like health, you're not going to see that directly. You're going to be far, you can't really measure that. So you're going to be much better off paying for houses that get sanitation or the amount of waste taken out of the environment. So you're down at outcomes or outputs. You have to be able to verify what's happened. So if it costs too much for the verification, that's not going to work. So you got to be able to do it at a reasonable cost. The point here about implementers being held accountable, it goes back to this being a contract. You don't want to go into this unless you really know what you're doing, because otherwise you're entering into a contract that you may not deliver on. Not a good thing to do. You want a small number of outcomes per project with very clear parameters to those outcomes. And you can try to structure some part of the payments to those outcomes instead of paying for the inputs. And everybody can see the thing. So last slide here, emerging lessons from the Gates Foundation experience with this. Not so easy to do, hard to design and monitor. Useful once you get through that stage, but it takes some time. It takes some money up front to do the structuring, and you have to know what you're doing. You want to set realistic goals. I know that sounds sort of obvious, but the experience apparently has been that organizations set goals that they're not actually going to be able to realistically reach. That's not good. You want to, but again, part of this is the journey and figuring that out through the dialogue. Some implementers are more comfortable switching to outcome-based funding than others. Some may think that they're comfortable switching to outcome-based funding until they actually have to do it. You really want to make sure this is the way you want to operate. The point on flexibility or innovation I raised earlier, there are folks who say that results-based financing allows for a lot of innovation. I don't agree with that. I think it allows, as I said, for flexibility in how things get done. But if you're entering into a contract and you have to innovate how you're going to deliver on the contract, I don't know, it seems like a fool's errand to me, but it'd be an enormous risk to do something where you really didn't know how you were going to get it done. Like any sorts of funding, this has its own inherent tensions, because once you've set one of these things up, there's still pressure to disperse the money. The funders want to know that something's happening. And so what happens if you want to disperse the money, but the outcomes aren't there? That creates a tension. There's also going to often as most of us know who've been doing this for a while, things don't always work out the way they look like they're going to work out. And so sometimes there are some early failures, and you need to have an ability to do that. Finally, I will leave you with a slide that came from our friends at Social Finance, but Jan Willem at the Gates Foundation said he fully endorsed. It is a funding instrument, but it is very much a way of working. So I hope that didn't confuse you more. I hope it actually created some clarity. And with that, let's get on to the examples.
Hi, my name is Paul Gunstenson, and I'm the director of WASH at the Stone Family Foundation. Lewis, that's a perfect introduction. You've covered like half of my presentation, which is great. We're a UK-based charitable foundation and an impact investor that's been active in the sector for probably the last 15 years. And I think one of the things I want to stress is like one of the things we believe in at the foundation is it's our role to drive forward innovative finance and to deploy capital as catalytically as we can. We see that as the role of foundations, and in particularly ours, and that's why we've entered into this. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the rural sanitation DIB in Cambodia. So I'll run through some headlines. I'll talk about the structure. I'll talk about some lessons learned and why I think it's been successful to date, and then a sort of bigger picture wrap up. But the headlines are, it's the first development impact bond in sanitation. The first of many, we hope. There is essentially $10 million of outcome funding that's been provided by USAID. And that's to develop rural sanitation markets in Cambodia. So this development impact bond has been designed to support IDE's super successful SMSU program in Cambodia. For those that don't know, IDE have been implementing it for about 10 years. They've delivered 350,000 latrines, I think. And they've really nudged service coverage or coverage in rural areas from about 20% to 80% in Cambodia. So hugely successful. And this development impact bond is supporting the final iteration of that program. And that's an important thing to think about. In terms of the outcome target, as Lewis was talking about, like what this DIB is designed to try and do is support 1,600 villages in Cambodia to achieve open defecation-free status by 2023. Now, the reason we picked that outcome is because it's a government-backed, sector-identified target that sits within the National Action Plan of Cambodia, which has been super successful as well. The government has had a lot of success in really transforming sanitation coverage in rural areas over the last 20 years. It's also the outcome of a fairly intensive process, which we'll come back to in a bit. And I guess the other point to make is the DIB sits within the wider SMSU 3 program. And within that program, there is a focus on ODF plus, the sustainability of the private sector, all of the elements that I'm sure that within this room that we would be worried about, but the DIB is just focused on this metric. And to Lewis's point, we've zoomed in on that, and we were really aligned as partners around why that was important. And the sort of the rationale is, safe sanitation stops the spread of disease, improves health. And particularly for USAID, they were very interested in aligning that around the reduction of stunting, which is a huge problem in Cambodia. In terms of the structure, and Lewis, again, has covered this quite well, the key thing to note is there are 3 partners in this. As the foundation, we are the impact investor. IDE is the implementing agency, and USAID is the outcome funder. We're all playing to our strengths. We're all playing different roles. And essentially what we've done as the impact investor is provided working capital, if you want to use that finance term, to IDE to deliver a program that we due diligenced and we understood. And they use that money to implement. That delivers results. Those results are reported to USAID. And then USAID pays us, the foundation, our funds back. Now, the important thing to note is that we haven't put $10 million into IDE. We've provided about a quarter of that. And this mechanism has a recycling element to it. So every 6 months, we report to USAID, they release money back to us, and then we recycle that back to IDE. And eventually, we'll stop recycling, and the foundation will recoup its investment and a return back. So that's how the structure works in practice. And as Lewis says, this is all about the transfer of risk. We as the foundation have taken on all of the financial risk. IDE has taken on a little bit of the financial risk, a tiny bit, but they've taken on implementation risk. They, as Lewis says, they have to know they can deliver this program, and we have to believe that they can. And that's where the risk sits. USAID fundamentally has taken no risk, and that's why they're very happy. I think the other thing to note is, and some of you may have noticed, but there is no independent verifier in this structure. That is different to a lot of other payment by results structures and different to other DIBs. And I'll come back to why, but that's ultimately enabled us to make sure, independent verification is great, it's important, it's expensive, and it's meant that we can actually channel more of the funds that USAID has towards impact. That's not going to work in every structure. It does in this. But it's an important thing to note. The impact rationale, basically, why did we bother? Why did we do it? And you'll hear this as a common critique of DIBs and payment by results structures. They're too hard, too complicated. They cost a lot of money to set up. Why would you bother? Why not just give it a grant? Why not just give them a grant? And this is actually the question that USAID asked us. They challenged us in the due diligence process and said, why would we do this? Why wouldn't we just give them a grant? And I think it's really important. If you're going to do payment by results or a DIB or any other structure, you have to be really focused on why you're doing it. Why this structure? Why now? What's the problem you're trying to solve? Is this the right mechanism to solve that problem? And that was the question we asked social finance, who helped structure this. We entered in and said, look, does this program have the elements of a payment by results structure? And if it does it have the elements that could be a DIB? And we were very prepared for the answer to be no. And I think that's really important, because what you hear a lot of people talking about at the moment is, I want to do a DIB, I want to do payment by results. But they don't really understand why, and why that structure will help them achieve that goal. And I think that's really important. So for us, it was 4 things really. IDE's program, super successful, market-based solution, but they were starting to really struggle to sell latrines. And they knew that they had to pivot their program. As they were coming down the bell curve, they were, into sort of marketing speak, they were meeting the laggards, those most marginalized, those who couldn't afford, those who didn't want to. And so they had to pivot their program away from pure market-based approaches to something a bit more with a set of tools, right? Including subsidies at the end, which is something that IDE way back 10 years ago would never have done, probably. So there was a program pivot. There was a question that was that we wanted to try and answer for. And, for us, what we were challenging IDE to think about was, well, look, unless you get to 80, 85, 90, 95% coverage in those communities, you run the risk that you don't realize the public health gains of community level sanitation. So we were trying to challenge them to say, well, what are you going to do about that? Because that's really important. Otherwise, you may have wasted 10 years of programming and not achieve the actual impact that we want to achieve. For us as a foundation, we take risks. I personally believe that's what foundations should be doing. We should be taking the most risk. And for us, funding SMSU2, we were starting to not take as much risk as we wanted to. And we started to question, well, is this the best use of our capital versus, say, other bilateral funders who are less risk or more risk averse, but you're guaranteeing sort of success. And so that was part of our thinking. Like, we felt we wanted to shift our role back to being a risk-taking organization or providing risk capital, having been a grant funder. And we valued the impact enormously, but we just thought, well, is this the best use of our capital? And so the DIB enabled us to shift back into that role. And I suppose it's a marker of success, right? We've done it in other portfolio organizations that we work with. Over time, we've managed to support that organization to become investable, if you like, which I think is important. And then for USAID, it aligned perfectly with what they were trying to achieve in Cambodia. So, we happened to hit them at the right time. They were programming, they were thinking about things. And so there was that strong alignment, both with what USAID wanted and it aligns us very well with what the government of Cambodia is trying to achieve as well. in terms of the elements of a successful launch, I think, we had worked with IDE for 6, 7, 8 years. We knew them very well. We trusted them. And collectively, we used that to then design the impact bond. We had some tough conversations right at the beginning about whether this was a good idea or not. And we had to sort of really sell it into the senior management. But I think they went on that journey with us. And I think that trusted relationship really supported that. It then also helped us build a very strong relationship with USAID. And I would like to sort of say publicly that USAID were amazing in this process. And, the people we worked with in the mission in Cambodia, the support they got from DC, the support they got from their regional office was fantastic. They were fully bought into it. And I think that really helped. And it helped us do it over a very short time frame. To Lewis's point, I think what works here is like there was a proven approach. This was a program that was operating at scale. It knew what it had to do. It knew how it had to pivot. It understood its costs, which is a really important part of this. And from that, we were able to then price the risk that was associated with that. And I think that's really, really important. This is about taking a program at scale and sort of nudging it over and almost sort of finishing the job, as is how we described it. And what underpins it is a very strong financial model and operating model, which we were able to do diligence. It gave us a lot of confidence that IDE knew what they were doing and how they were going to do it. And I think that really helped USAID as well. Again, echoing what Lewis says, good quality data. Like IDE has amazing data, good, clean, almost real time. And that gave us a lot of confidence, and USAID, because they do diligence as well, that we didn't need a verifying agent, that we had enough there and we could build enough processes around that where we didn't have to pay for an independent verifier. And I think that's been successful so far. And I think we were able to pull together a strong team. We brought sector expertise, finance expertise, structuring, and some institutional knowledge. And it was interesting that USAID brought a lot of that to bear as well. So that was very impressive from their side. And then in terms of the bigger picture, for me, I think there's beauty in simplicity, right? There are 3 partners, and that's it. There's one investor, one implementer, one outcome payer. You will hear critiques of DIBS that say, there's too many players, too many stakeholders, it's too complicated, we can't align, the transaction costs start to increase. Having 3 partners that aligned around that goal, that we could reference, we understood it, we could monitor it, we had good data, meant we could do a design phase in 9 months. There are some DIBs that had taken 2 years. And obviously then all the costs that go with that. It means there's a low transaction cost, and that sounds a bit crass, but what that means is you've got more finance for social impact. You're not wasting it on legal fees and discussions, endless discussions. And there's no holding company, there's no special purpose vehicle. We haven't had to set anything up that then has a cost associated with it. IDE has taken on that implementation risk and they're delivering it. We've taken on the financial risk and the management risk. And for me, I think I'd like to hope that this is an example of how impact investors might be able to engage in supporting these later stage sanitation programs at scale. And to be able to, to balance that need for social impact, which is very important, but also have some financial return. But what we always say to people is, look, this is a super risky sector. We all know that. And you need patience. You need to understand the sector. But if you can do those things, this is what you can achieve, I think. You can deploy your capital with high social impact and some financial return. And, we all know the sector is chronically underfunded. That's why we're all in here this week, is to try and address some of these problems. So I'm hoping that this is a way to try and crowd in additional finance, potentially. The last thing I would say is, and we said it in our session yesterday about pipe water, is like, this is not a panacea to all ills, right? And it's really important that people don't think it is. These things work in the right context, with the right partners, with the right thinking. And it's fundamental you focus on the why. Why are you even bothering? Because if you can't answer that question, the effort is not worth it, I would argue. So that's it.
Good afternoon. I'm going to start with a bit of context about Sanergy so that you can understand, I think, exactly to where Paul just left off, why we think this is a good fit for the work we're doing at Sanergy generally, and particularly why we think this is the right moment to do it. To start, I'm Lindsay Stradley, and I'm one of the co-founders of Sanergy. So at Sanergy, we focus on serving dense urban areas. And in Kenya, more than 10 million people live in urban informal settlements, more than 3 million in Nairobi alone, and 70% of them do not have access to safe sanitation services. Obviously, as cities grow, the challenge is going to continue to grow far more complicated. So the urgency is great. In these very dense areas, the government critically needs affordable, safe sanitation solutions at scale that can get waste out of rapidly growing informal settlements. That is the challenge 10 years into Nairobi as we see it. So at Sanergy, we meet this need through a range of non-sewered sanitation services. Our primary model is a network of more than 4,000 container-based sanitation facilities, which we empty regularly, transporting 18,000 tons of fecal sludge out of the informal settlements to a partner who treats and reuses that waste. In total, we serve more than 170,000 people daily in Nairobi with safely managed sanitation services. When we started in Nairobi more than a decade ago, our non-sewered solutions were considered pretty radical. I remember some early conversations with the Ministry of Health, among others, sort of said like, okay, good luck to you. Let us know how that goes. And we really needed a proof of concept that this could work. And I would say we very much have that now. Today, our scale and impact have demonstrated that container-based sanitation is viable, even critical option for government and utilities. And in fact, just recently, Kenya's Ministry of Water and Sanitation revised its previous target of 100% sewage coverage in cities to now 40%, targeting 40% sewers and at least 40% non-sewered in the coming years. And I think that really reflects the successful implementation of container-based sanitation and other non-sewered sanitation services in Kenya by Sanergy and by Sanitation, who's also working in Kenya. So that is the context. This is sort of the moment at which we find ourselves. So stepping back from what we've done, it's critical to remember, and we firmly believe, that governments do bear the mandate for providing sanitation solutions, sanitation services to its citizens. Our goal is to secure a performance-based contract. That's the flavor, as Lewis described, that enables the government to affordably meet its mandate and to scale our low-cost sanitation services to reach millions in the urban informal settlements in Kenya. And we see external results-based financing as a critical interim step toward a public performance-based contract. So I'm going to be talking about two things. One is a bridge to the other. So for Sanergy, results-based financing would secure the long-term funding needed to plan for optimal scaling that will then allow us to lower our per user cost to a level that the utility could afford to pay in a public performance-based contract. And perhaps most critically, set a precedent for such a performance-based contract. Over here on the right, for potential funders, results-based financing gives them value for money that keeps us accountable to the results that they also want to achieve. Or as Lewis put it more sharply, the alternative to you pay your money and you take your chances. This is the opposite of that. So in Nairobi, where again, we had to prove the concept at scale in order for government to see container-based sanitation or even any non-sewered sanitation as viable, desirable citywide option, we now need to reset our collaboration with government so that we're accountable to the results that they want to see. So it's a key shift that we need to make at this point in our scaling and our goal of partnering with them. The support from and the precedent with development partners in an external results-based financing mechanism strengthens the enabling environment for performance-based contract, in this case intended with Nairobi Water and other key government partners in Nairobi. And results-based financing allows Synergy to concretely define the results that matter most to the government and to us, so define with them, and to credibly prove our ability to achieve those results, and then to create the runway to that more formal paid partnership. I think it's also important to note in terms of why this can be a good fit in Nairobi, is that our government partners have been part of such contracts in various ways, in particular through Kenya's Water Sector Trust Fund, with support from development partners such as the World Bank, USAID, KfW, who have, again, focused on kind of output-based aid or various of the flavors as Lewis described. So this is not a completely new mechanism or concept. So here's now that kind of logic framework, as Lewis is showing. In our case, our results-based financing and a future performance-based contract with Nairobi would be built on these key impact metrics in yellow. These are metrics that are important to us, and more importantly, to the government. So to summarize, this is number of open facilities, like an uptime metric, and tons of waste safely removed from the community for safe treatment. That's both from our container-based facilities and from the pit latrines that we service. So as a first step toward contracting based on those metrics, we needed to be able to understand the impact that we could have with each of them. And like I said, and as Lewis said, you have to have great data, and it needs to be able to be verified. So we've been working over the past year with social finance, and with them built a rigorous model that charts our growth against a number of those metrics that we saw in Nairobi over the coming years, and seeing that the impact that we will achieve along the way. And I will echo or sort of emphasize some of the points that both Lewis and Paul made, that this is not a small undertaking. The sort of even just getting to this place and now in the design phase that we're in, has been a very rigorous and time-consuming process. And we've appreciated the support from many of the folks here in this room along that way, both to design it and to go through the level of diligence that we have the confidence that certainly is needed to take this implementation risk. So overall, the model then shows, as you can see here, that the results-based financing in Nairobi can help us reach 500,000 people in Nairobi, service 12,000 toilets, and safely manage 140,000 tons of sanitation waste. This would be with funding of $19 million over 3.5 years. At the end of that period, the government will be able to contract directly with Sanergy with clear metrics at an affordable per capita price. And that sets up long-term, sustainable, safely managed sanitation as part of a citywide inclusive approach to reach everyone in Nairobi. So we're confident in these steps, not just in the data and in our ability to execute on that initial contract, that results-based financing contract, but also confident that this sets us up for that later performance-based contract directly with Nairobi, because we're already moving toward such a performance-based contract in Kisumu with the Kisumu Water and Sanitation Company, or Kiwasco. And after signing an MOU with them, we have collaborated to first develop a roadmap which outlines how they can serve everyone in Kisumu through a citywide inclusive approach. We then launched a pilot in a Nylinda informal settlement, which grew rapidly, already serving more than 10,000 people. And all of this has been with really active, ongoing support from Kiwasco, including land and waste treatment. So we are confident in this case that once we achieve a target, the target of 20,000 people that we've jointly set as the sort of pilot result with Kiwasco, that we want to transition to a performance-based contract. And in that case, in Kisumu, we think we can get to payment for results without external development partners needed to get involved as our direct funders. It's distinct from Nairobi, where again, we really need to, this large scale, remains a large scale proof of concept of what container-based sanitation can do at a really citywide level. So looking at this shift toward results-based financing and performance-based contracting in Nairobi and Kisumu, we have seen it offers a clear path to engage government in a partnership to align on the exact results that they want, and then for us to achieve them with them. It's not easy. I will very much echo those points that Paul and Lewis have already made. It's been rigorous. It's been sometimes slow, but it does set us up for the right long-term partnerships that are really needed for sustainable sanitation service delivery at a citywide level, for Nairobi and beyond. So we are confident and committed, if maybe sometimes impatient. And I think, again, many of you here in this room for your coaching and support and funding to help get us to this place. So thanks.
Thank you. We're going to talk a little bit about the instruments of the bank have been used not only for sanitation, but for many other sectors called Program for Results. And this Program for Results basically help us on the scale out of the investment. So my name is Miguel Vargas Ramirez. I'm a lead water and sanitation specialist working on citywide inclusive sanitation. So the Program for Result is an instrument of the bank that is used, as I mentioned, different sectors, and it has been proven to change the sanitation sector itself. Is to advance the agenda in many countries as in Egypt, Burkina Faso, and many others, to using this result-based mechanism. Also, one of my points here, and my main message is that the result-based financing can and also should be able to not only deliver on the outputs, but also deliver it on the transformation of the sector to make sure that those outputs are sustainable. So we have seen many wastewater treatment plants, many abandoned latrines. So how can we use the result-based mechanism to also trick and incentivize the creation of an institutional structure that is able to sustain those outputs? Related to this, what we call the disbursement link indicators is another word for that result-based financing can advance both infrastructure goals as well as policy goals. And finally, what you're saying, Lindsay and Paul and Luis and everybody, is that sector transformation requires a long-term engagement. It's not a 2-year project and 4-year project. Is something that needs to be taken in the long term. So allowing those disbursement link indicators to be a stage is a critical part of that sequencing. Here we have a typical flow of funds of results and verification for a PforR. So this is not necessarily particular for the sanitation sector, but rather any program for results that the bank finances follow pretty much the same pathway. And it's not very different from the other mechanisms that my colleagues have presented here. So we have that the disbursement link indicator, so the output is achieved by the project unit. The project unit could be the Ministry of Water, could be the water utility, the city is the one basically working at the project level. So this project unit checks and consolidates the results. There's the need for the scale and the amount of resources investment to have an independent verification agency that verifies those DLIs, the disbursement link indicators. The World Bank verifies the reports and disburse the loan to the government, and the government receives the funds. So here we see very, very simple schematic way of how it does. So the World Bank disburses to a program account at national level. The government, since this is a governmental project, it's not like a separate part of the government project, but rather we're financing what the government wants to do. So the government funds and the World Banks are mixed to a special account, and that special account is the one that basically pays at the end to the contractors and the suppliers and the consultants once they get to the results. So we're talking about scaling up and large. Nigeria is probably one of the good examples, given the amount of the population is the giant in Africa in terms of population and challenges. So we wanted to present the Nigeria SORWASH, which is the Sustainable Urban and Rural Water Supply, Sanitation, and Hygiene Program for Results. So that number that you see there is the number that will give you all the information. All of our information is public, but let me just say that this is a $700 million project to support the program of Nigeria to basically comply with these three objectives. One is the continued functionality of water and sanitation systems. The second is work on the policy, institutional, and regulatory environment. And then we also have some performance improvement action plans. Sorry, there's a typo, there is no indicators. Performance improvement action plans to be able to make sure that whoever is in charge of that infrastructure that is being received actually have the human capacity, they have the resources, they have the technical expertise to be able to sustain that infrastructure later on in time. So it benefits 7 states, both water and sanitation. And we'll see specifically what are the indicators associated to this project. So this, at midday today, we have the launching of a report that talks about PIR, which are policies, institutes, and regulations. So I think it's important to emphasize this point, which is that at the bank, we realize that infrastructure is not enough. You can provide the infrastructure decays if there's no proper mechanisms. So we really emphasize on this part of policies that really at the state level and at the federal level, you have the incentives to the service provider to provide the services. I mean, it's not unfunded mandates. The institutional structure, you have clear mandates. Who regulates, who is the service providers, who does the planning, who does the setting of the tariff, and the institutions to carry out those policy mandates. And there should be a regulatory framework, not necessarily having a regulatory agency for each state for water and for sanitation. There's many ways of regulation. There could be a regulation by contract, regulation by different indicators. There's economic regulation, there's environmental regulation, but that regulatory framework is the one that creates the accountability once the funds are received. And again, the point of everybody, this is not something that is gonna take months, it's gonna take years to be able to build this institutional structure to be able to carry out with the outputs. So here, this is the way that the resources are allocated. And the idea of this disbursement link indicator is to create incentives for each one of these, what we call results areas. So we have one result area, which is the sector policy. And I have highlighted here in green and in red, the ones that have to be, that deal with sanitation. So we have a disbursement link indicator for 35 million for a state policy institutions and regulation for each one of the 7 states that we're benefiting. And we also see here disbursement link indicators 5, 6, and 7 with the actual hardware, with the actual delivery. So the number 5 is for households. Number 6 is for communities that have achieved open defecation free status. And the 7 is the sanitation part of the schools and centers. So you can see that the idea of this is to provide a comprehensive package of support to Nigeria, but focusing on the results part. This is probably the core of my point that I want to try to explain here, which is how do you stage those disbursement link indicators? And this is part of the difficult part of the design to make sure that the whole mechanism, the whole machinery of providing the resources is going to work. So we have 4 streams here. The first one is pure PIR, policy, institutions, and regulation. And the idea is to start with a baseline, where we are. Do we have the mandates? Do we know exactly who is in charge of supporting the planning? Who should charge for the tariff? Who establishes the tariff? So this is the PIR baseline. We move along across the streamline, but there's another one related to the performance improvement plans. So we want to make sure that the planning at the state level and the federal level is linked to these policies. So there's a clear relationship between the PIR and the performance improvement. And in the third stream, we have now the infrastructure. So the idea is that when the infrastructure is ready at the 4th streamline, you already have the planning, or you already have 2 years of working on the institutions, on the regulation and the improvement. So you can really respond to the service delivery. So you're giving all the instruments, you're giving the mandate, you're giving the incentives, and now you're ready to respond with the infrastructure. And you have this independent verification, annual validation for each one of the results. So in the first year, at the end of 2022, there will be a verification, not in the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is not yet ready, but in terms of how we're doing in the first 3 streamlines. So finally, what have we learned so far in terms of this mechanism? So first of all is that PforR has support the delivery of important reforms. I mean, we have as an institution, a very large institution, we have delivered outputs and with a long time, as I mentioned before, but these are not sustainable. So we believe infrastructure is not enough. Service delivery is the key point. And the way to do this infrastructure sustainable is through the reforms. And we use this mechanism also to incentivize reform. So this PforR has created this momentum of both from the project level to the minister level, at the state level and the federal level, everybody's focused on the results. So we have to complete this policy. We have to complete this plan. We have to complete this infrastructure. So it has been everybody aligned because otherwise they won't receive the resources. There's also allow for focusing in terms of what it matters. I mean, what are those segments of the population where we need to concentrate? Do we want to pay more, basically, or, for a result that is achieved in a poor area, for example, or a particular technology that we want to incentivize? So this is also allow you to bias in a way, in a positive way, the type of results that you want to achieve. However, we also have had challenges and also some success factors. Among the challenges is like governments have been working with the bank for many years. They're accustomed to, okay, give me the money and start the procurement process. And they want to have that level of comfort. Also, in many institutions, what is important is the service delivery. Is not to inaugurate the beautiful wastewater treatment plant or the beautiful pipe, but it's rather people actually connecting and creating that level of comfort that the funds are coming, because they say, okay, I have, like Luis say, I signed this contract and I have to deliver. So, but I don't necessarily have all the resources. So what do I do? So creating that level of comfort is important also to work with the client. So to overcome that challenge, one of the success factors is you put a low hanging fruit at the beginning. So a PIR baseline, for example, is something relatively easy to do. It's just you go, you review how my policy, my legislation, and with that, I already give you the first tranche of money. So that the thing that I can do attitude that, this is not, it's difficult, but I can do it, is one of the success factors that have been reported by our client countries. However, we need also to check very carefully how the money is being disbursed. Have to take into account that these are government officials working on producing these plans, producing these performance improvement plans, and they need a cash flow. They actually counting on the resources of the bank to do this. So making sure the cash flow for them to be able to finance the people that do the contracts, that produce the outputs or produce the plans is an important aspect of the project. And finally, I want to say that linking the planning actions to the result is also another one of the success factors. What has happened traditionally in the sanitation sector is we have these grandiose 25, 35 years master plans when you say, okay, I work in the plan for 2-3 years, and by the time the plan is approved, it's already outdated and it's never implemented. So this creates a culture of what I'm planning in day one, in the first 2 years, is actually happen in year 3 and year 4. And I'm counting that I'm gonna be paid for those results that I'm planning today. So it gives you a more short time frame that I'm the planner, I'm gonna be the one responsible to achieving those results. So it creates a more close linkage, a more realistic planning between what I'm doing today and I'm gonna receive later on in a short term. So thank you so much. So I hope this is interesting.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, what we'll do is we'll start with if you have any clarification questions, not conceptual, but just on what was presented. We'll love to take those. Otherwise, we can move directly into panel discussion. One there. Anybody else? So that I can take 2 or 3. Okay, one at the back.
Sure. Yeah, sure, Rishi. So thank you also very much for those fantastic presentations. My name is Deepa. Actually, my first question, Paul, was to you because it was fascinating. It's a clarification. The cost of implementation wasn't 10 million, but USAID gave you 10 million. And they gave you that because they were paying for a risk that you were assuming on open defecation on an outcome of ODF, which is generally grant financed. So it's fascinating. I was curious to learn more about how you priced the risk and how you managed to convince USAID that this was worthy of paying that delta for. And was there some sort of like a DIB-induced recipe for ODF that you came out of this experience with that I'd love to learn about? And Lindsay, was just a clarification. You talked about optimal scaling and affordable pricing and designing procurement contracts based on that. We all know that in CBS, the per unit costs fall as you scale. So how does that feed into sort of like a procurement framing when you're talking about price with government? Is it just benchmarked to what households are paying now, or how do you build in some of those efficiencies as you scale in variable costs?
I'll just try and take one more at the back.
Yes, thank you for the interesting presentations. I have two questions. One is more of a clarification regarding the results-based financing in general, where I'm wondering if it's regarding the different parameters, if it's a yes or no target achieved, full payment disbursed, or not achieved and not disbursed, or if it's, for example, X amount for each toilet built or each cubic meter fecal sludge treated. That's question number one. And also what happens if you underperform or even overperform. And the second question to Lindsay regarding the people served and the toilets. I understand container-based sanitation and the conditions are limited in terms of space availability. It's just when I take the numbers, I see average toilet users of like over 40, which from the interface perspective, I would consider limited sanitation. But of course, you're collecting and treating it, making it safely managed, but how do you strike a balance? And is there a plan to actually serve every household with their own toilet in the future? Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe we can start with these four.
Yeah, thanks. So how do we price the risk? So unusually, I think, and Kate from Social Finance is in the room, so she's probably better placed to respond. But unusually, there was essentially USAID had a cap on their financing, right? They had 9.99 million to provide to the program. And so there was a ceiling on that. And so we had to work back from that point. Now, in other DIBs and other payment by result structures, you would hope there would actually be some opportunity for upside, right? Overperformance, and for that to be incentivized. Because of the way USAID works, that wasn't possible. They had an envelope of funding, and that's what we had to work towards. The DIB itself and the activities that lead to ODF status, as I was saying, is part of a broader program. So the total value of that program is 17 million. I'm looking at Sarah from IDE here, but it's 17 million. And there are other funders providing grant funding to that. But what we did is carve out the DIB element of it to then, and the value of that was essentially, plus the surplus that's generated is 10 million. So it's slightly different. There is no incentive for upside, right? So that's actually a risk to us, because there's no incentive for overperformance. Well, the overperformance can come if IDE are more efficient at how they deliver the outcome, but there is no kind of upside for over delivery, which you would actually want probably in a payment by result structure. Ultimately, you'd want that opportunity to overperform and for it to kind of keep going. But we're slightly restrained in that way. Now, like the ultimate goal, I suppose, of these DIBs is that the government is the outcome payer. So you would hope that in the next iterations of these, that then the government continues to value, and that's hopefully where Sanogy's model will come in, that they would eventually, the government will just keep paying for that and try and incentivize Sanogy to do even more, if they value it as a cost-effective solution. So does that answer your question? Yeah. I'm not sure about the secret sauce bit, but
just one other point. I mean, and Kate may want to answer this better than I can, but you can design these how you want to design them. And I've certainly seen them designed where there was sort of a minimum level of expected performance and then a bonus payment for above that. So you can, again, these are bespoke products that are designed for each situation. So if the mutually agreed goals are that you want a certain level and then a bonus payment, you can certainly do that.
All right, I'll take a stab at, I think, the few for me. So I'm not sure I totally got the question on pricing, but let me take a shot and then tell me. So for the results-based financing from sort of external like development partners, that would be priced based on like what are our costs. So the way we've done the model is what is our total cost to reach that 500,000 people. We know we can very easily then project our earned revenues from that, and basically the financing gap is what we're looking to cover through results-based financing, and then dividing that out across the units to be covered. So it's not based on like a pricing from there's earned revenue that is set for the price, but for the government, like a performance-based contract, in that case, I think it's almost also like what Paul was saying, kind of working backwards. So as we started to talk, for example, with Kisumu, about, well, what might this, what what are the exact units that they would want to pay for. It's most likely, and the same now with Eldoret is another city in Kenya that we've recently signed an agreement with, that looking at the people served and the units and what are the revenues that they can collect or that they can budget for on that basis, and then sort of paying us for those. So on day one in these cities, I don't think you're going to get to a place, you're not necessarily going to get to a place where it's fully covering that whole cost. And like your first day of your performance-based contract, there will still be in those cities continued need to reduce your cost and a continued need to support, a higher budget envelope for the utilities to, till those two can meet. But the initial point would be kind of backing into what they can pay based on the unit that they want to pay for. And to the question, so yes, our toilets, so I didn't go into a lot of detail of what our network looks like. Most of our toilets are what I would call, my own new JMP term, private shared sanitation, which the keen observers in the room would know is not technically then would be considered improved sanitation. They are shared typically in a plot by all the, by the neighbors in one gated space. So they are therefore private, but yes, shared across multiple households. For our shared facilities, they average 34 people per facility. Then we also support manual pit emptiers with safe management of sanitation. So that's also part of your clarification, where some of the numbers, if you divide out by number of toilets, there are three things happening there. There's private shared facilities. We do have a smaller number of individual household facilities that serve an average of 4 people each. And then we have additional waste that we make sure is safely treated that comes from originally from pit latrines.
Thank you. So what we can do is we can do a quick round of questions. I heard the presentations with a lot of interest. So one of the things which is always of interest when you're doing performance-based anything, contract, especially as Lucia put it, is that it can create perverse incentives, right? It can create perverse incentives on how you decide targets. Miguel, you talked about low-hanging fruits. Essentially, I might want to do contract only for low-hanging fruits, right? Because I know I can do it. So how do you sort of plan for that in terms of making sure that monetary incentives do not crowd out the moral and the philanthropic incentives that we are trying to work with in terms of either communities, in terms of looking at areas or individuals within the overall picture? I'm happy for anybody to take this.
No worries. No, I appreciate it's a pretty difficult question for the panel. So this is a lot of the work that we'll be helping people to. Sorry, I'm Kate. I'm an associate director at Social Finance. We're a not-profit. I work in the international development team, trying to accelerate progress to the SDGs using a range of outcomes-based, results-based financing tools. So have worked with Stone Family Foundation and Sanergy on the panel. And so to the question around perverse incentives, when you're in the sort of feasibility design stage of this work, you would be thinking about the different potential metrics that you would want to utilize. And we would typically go through quite a rigorous process to try and think about, what kinds of behavior might you be incentivizing if you were to use this as a metric? And therefore, what are the sort of pros and cons of considering that? So for example, if you were to incentivize the collection or the delivery of waste at, the collection of waste only, then that you could feasibly say that just by collecting waste and not measuring the treatment or the delivery of waste at a treatment plant, you could be paying people to collect waste, but then it could be just dumped into the environment, for example. So just thinking about kind of what are the potential impacts all the way along that chain within the sanitation value chain, but the same rules apply for other development impact bonds or results-based payments.
But I think fundamentally it's about the alignment, right? You have to be aligned as to what. And if you don't have alignment between the investor or the funder, the implementer, and whoever's ultimately going to pay for it, it's flawed, right? And so you have to spend that time getting that alignment up front. And that's where we spend most of the time with you with IDE, was understanding what they were trying to achieve. Why did we actually value that? And then the same with USA. Did they value that metric? Because ultimately they're the ones, or the government is the one who's going to pay for that. So you have to, you have to really value that metric, but be clear, as Kate says, that you're not incentivizing what you want to achieve, that collectively you all believe that is the thing that you want to achieve, if that makes sense.
You also had enough of a track record. You also had enough of a track record with IDE, and you trusted them enough as an organization that you decided you didn't even need an independent verification, which is unusual, but as you said, it reduced the costs. So as long as all three of the parties were happy, it worked.
Thanks. So the other question I had was more for Miguel and Lindsay. You're working with governments, which one could argue you might be entrenching the behavior that doesn't work right now. With due apologies to anybody from government present here. But also in my experience, governments can be great transformers if you can find the right kind of construct, whether it's institution, whether it's a champion within the government. So as you think about doing this, Miguel, please jump in here, how do you sort of go and figure out who to work with, right? Because is it sort of champions? Is it governments? Is it institutions?
I think it's everybody. I mean, it cascades, and every DLI has like a responsible champion. Overall, when we lend to the Minister of Finance, or overall, the whole government is in charge. But this DLI and the performance improvement plans allocates responsibility sort of for the DLIs. So in that way, as you allocate the resources and you allocate the responsibilities in an equal manner. And so related to that, like a secondary objective of the bank is also making the machinery of the delivery, the governmental delivery work. So basically, we are interested in the result, as we're interested in the capacity of the government to produce the results. So we feel like it's a double like a double benefit, because not only we're happy that we're delivering, 500 ODF communities, but we're also as excited that the government itself uses the country systems on their own to be able to deliver those. Because it's like, it's like a winning, like you're the sort of like a coach, like you win not only you score, but your team also feel empowered that they can score. So in a way that's the issue of the design of putting the performance improvement plans. But in that way, you can really measure what they promised they were going to do, and the independent verification agency can come and measure the results. I don't know if it was clear. So it's a full alignment. No, you as a financer, you have to be fully aligned to the people producing the results.
Yeah, no, I mean, so at Synergy, I think we are excellent service delivery providers. We are not the government. As I said in the presentation, definitely believe that the government has the mandate for providing sanitation. And so I do think it is important to do the slower, more painful, but long-term work to embed the services through government contract. We started in Nairobi because there was a huge need, and we saw that as the right place to kind of test out these ideas and ultimately prove out the concept. And now, as we've done anything beyond Nairobi, we look like the key element is to find cities that want to walk that journey with us, that have the champions. And so often that might be the managing director at the water service provider, also in the county, also down the chain. I think one of the early lessons we learned in Kisumu was that we had great initial buy-in, for example, with the managing director, and we had kind of skipped over a lot of the buy-in and more like kind of capacity development, bringing more of the rest of the management sort of with us on that journey. And so we've kind of gone back and done that now. So I think it's key to find your initial champions, make sure that all of the conditions are right for the interest and the ability to find a budget, and to kind of reinforce those champions, and build that capacity and learn from, certainly learn from your partners a lot along the way too.
The final one from me was in terms of outputs and outcomes. And I'm looking at Kate as well, because, we have extended the panel to include her, to sort of say, because some of the funding I was looking at was output funding, right? And Miguel, some of the funding you talked about was outcome funding. How do you ensure consistent usage rather than just hardware? What's the software change is going to look like? So when you're designing, outcomes are always much, much harder to do evaluation on. So if you're doing DEBs, if you're doing any performance-based contract, how do you evaluate outcomes rather than outputs?
Yeah, no. Well, there's two answers to that part. So the first part is like, okay, by creating the mechanism of delivery and putting emphasis on this and creating the capacity, you implicitly also financing the sustainability of that, those outcomes, those outputs. And for some of the indicators, I don't have the exact wording or the exact frequency of the verification, but the IVA, the Independent Verification Agency, actually goes back 1 year later and check on the very same connection that was built. Is it still functional? And it gives a top up. And this is part of many of our performance PforR projects, not only in sanitation, but on rural water, Vietnamese being the poster case in that way, that we want to make sure that it's not only one time, because what happened is the engineers go and run and fix, the IVA is coming, let's fix everything. So the water is, go and measure 1 year, okay, after that, no. So they do it randomly. They're doing sampling in a way that, and they do it by surprise. The IVA comes and checks. So in a way that is good to understand exactly what is the dynamic of the sustainability, but it also put the emphasis on the government to allocate the appropriate budgets for operation and maintenance. That is not only once off, but you also have a top up if you want the first year and the second year. The thing is, these projects are usually 5 years, 7 years. So you can, the opportunity to go and verify is only once or twice at the most. And you don't want to overspend on verification rather than, the management of the project.
Anybody else want to? Otherwise, we'll open the floor. Did you want to add on?
I think I was just going to add, as Lewis said in his presentation, you want to kind of push the metric to as close as possible down the theory of change or your logical framework. So you're really, sometimes it may be outputs, and that's okay. So for example, in something like the sustainment of something. So for example, in employment, you might say, well, I train somebody in a new skill and then they get a job. That's an output. But if they have that job 6 months later, that's your outcome. In sanitation, so with Sanergy, for example, we could say that, getting people to opening the new network, you could say that the sustainment of that network could be an outcome. However, what we know is that because they're serving the poorest of the poor, that there could potentially be a perverse incentive to really push to make that network stay open. And so then you have to think about, well, actually, is it a different outcome that you should be incentivizing, i.e. the collection of waste, because then it takes that pressure away from the individual users themselves. So just, I guess, there's also that balance between what you choose as your outcome metric and then thinking about the potential incentives as well.
Terrific presentation by all of you. It was really great. I've been learning a lot and stimulating tons of questions, but I'll only ask one. For Paul, is it? Or yeah, from Stone Foundation, you presented that triangle, your first thing, and said the strength of this is it's really simple. It only has 3 actors. But, and I might be totally wrong on this, okay? But my understanding of IDE's model in Cambodia is that they, in turn, a part of their role, and my colleagues here can correct me who are from IDE, is working with the local private sector, who then sells those latrines to household. So those are more actors and more financial flow. I mean, somebody is that is not part of your sort of flow of funds. It's additional flow of funds, I think, but I'm not totally sure. Yeah. So I'm not sure what, I don't really have a question. I don't understand it. You know.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. Have you seen or experienced cases where this results-based financing failed, and like if there are cases, why are those cases there, and also how much does that actually hurt the implementer, like if they don't receive the funds?
Thank you very much. Quite a broad question from Miguel. It's just around any of the particular challenges around designing incentives or rewards that reward performance at kind of a higher level. So focusing on the enabling environment, you mentioned a couple of them there. Are there any particular difficulties that you have to factor in when designing that?
And we'll take one final from Harun. It's yours or it's online? Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for that.
You. So this is from Barbara Schreiner, and her question is two-parted. I'm interested to hear from the investors as to what extent they are finding corruption as a risk in this sector and what they have put in place to minimize the corruption risk. And part 2 of that question is, in terms of work on the regulatory environment, does this include building that capacity for ensuring accountability and for addressing corruption?
Yeah, ultimately you're right. IDE, we've provided working capital to IDE, and they implement their program. As part of their program, they are paying sales agents, they're building the capacity of the private sector to respond. They're working with commune, district, provincial level chiefs. So all of that flows, but that would be normal in an input model as opposed to an outcome model. What we've done is we've provided the working capital for them to implement to start with. So does that respond to your question? I mean, at a very top line level, we give money to IDE, they spend it, we report that to USAID, they pay us, we pay IDE, they do stuff, and that's the kind of circle, the triangle rather, that we're doing. So it would be the same on an input-based model or an outcome-based model. It's that those costs that you're talking about, or those flows, are the normal costs of implementation, I think. So does that make sense?
I mean, we could do this after that. I just want to make sure we do answer all the questions. So there was a question on how does a failure on RBF impact an implementer's life?
I'll speak very briefly and I'll pass to Miguel. I mean, ultimately, if IDE don't deliver the milestones, they're not verified, USA don't accept them, they don't pay for them. And then there's less money coming back into that triangle we just talked about. And ultimately, then there's less money to implement. So it starts to put an awful lot of pressure on the implementer. But that's where your planning, your operational model, your financial model is so important, that it's realistic. But it's realistic, it's achievable, but it has a stretch within it, right? And that's a really difficult thing to balance. And you have to align on that. Is this achievable? Do we know that this number can, but the non-performance level in the DIB is very high. Like IDE have to be performing at like over 90% for all of the funds to come back in the way that we anticipate. So the performance level is very, very high. And so that puts pressure on IDE, but they're brilliant. And they've been delivering the DIB fantastically so far. So.
No, I think it's a very interesting question. And again, has many answers. One is, one of the things that we've seen that typically makes the system fail or partially fail is that there's not enough or upfront cash or upfront resources or transferring even the resources. The resources are available at the central level, and when they trickle down, it's already July, August, and December is the verification. So the internal public administration mechanism is not fast enough to be able to produce the results on time. What happened is that some of these indicators, disbursement indicators, can be claimed a year later. So this is something that is happened. However, you can also see that the definition, the exact definition of the indicator and the full understanding of what the level of performance is for each indicator is something that you have to analyze and study very well upfront. I give an example of sewage. What is rehabilitation and what is replacement? So, I mean, you cannot argue that, you know, changing a valve is that maintenance or is that rehabilitation? And then you can go back and forth. So the definition upfront has to be crystal clear between, you know, the financer, the performer, and the IVA. So that alignment needs to be there. The other question about corruption, my argument is that performance-based financing is actually better in terms of avoiding corruption, because the corruption is not borne by the financer. So when you have an input-based, a traditional financing, then you finance the contractor and you don't know whether results are coming or not, or you don't know exactly the quantity of the results. So by having result-based financing, you sort of minimize the corruption, because if there's corruption, but the results are there, it's a lesser level of corruption than if you just pay for the inputs and the results never arrive. So this is one aspect. The IVA is very important to verify that the process is correct, that the results are legit. So I think this also helps in the sort of reduction of the corruption if you have performance-based contracting.
I'll just add one more point to the question about RBFs failing. So some years ago, maybe 8 years ago, 9 years ago, in our very early days, we took on results-based financing and did not hit our targets. Fortunately, we did better than the others in the consortium, so we were able to negotiate and we still got paid. But it was a lesson why, that's why we then said, okay, let's go about figuring out how we really do this, how we can get to the right level of confidence that we need before revisiting this now, like nearly a decade later. So in our case, that I think, worked out. We were working with DFID as it was then, and they were, I think, saw that as a useful learning for themselves as they were trying to create a different kind of results-based financing mechanism at that point. And I think we all took some useful learnings and didn't do it right away.
Having been on the board of Sanergy at that point and having been part of the rather awkward discussion with the funder, I would say one thing that definitely set us apart from some of the other people under the program is we said it early. When we realized we weren't going to reach and we told them, and they really appreciated that. That helped resolve the problem ultimately, is that we were just straight up honest about it. So.
Any other questions?
Hi. So both of these cases, you've got IDE and you've got Sanergy. Are we saying then that the results-based financing needs that kind of organization? Because both of them have underneath private sector, slightly more informal potentially. You've got the emptiers, you've got the local private sector. Are we saying you need that kind of organization there for this to function? Or can you work with emptiers directly, for example, on results-based?
So any other question before we take that? Yeah.
maybe a follow-up question and partly answering the previous question. So I'm Sarah Castellan, the Global Wash Director for IDE. We've been very fortunate to work with the Stone Family Foundation for many years. So my part question, which was for Miguel, is whether engaging in this results-based financing for the government is inducing them to be more results-based. So are they doing more results-based contracts with their contractors because they're taking on risk that they might not be able to achieve their targets? So and they're not, the program implementing units in most cases are not delivering the program themselves. So are you seeing more results-based contracts so they can minimize their own risk and pass it on? And then on the implementer side, IDE has been working on results-based financing. We didn't call it that for many years, where we provide incentive payments for the local actors that we work with to achieve results. And we pay very close attention to the perverse incentives, really making sure that the results are sustainable. But that's a way for us to minimize our risk as well, as we're encouraging performance from the ground up as well, so that we're more likely to hit our targets. And we try to, and we work with a range of actors to make it possible. So Stone Family Foundation is not signing performance contracts with each of the entrepreneurs that we work with, but we do everything that we can to be able to deliver on those results. So we work with local governments, we work with entrepreneurs, we work with sales agents to find every possible pathway to achieve those results. And for us, the advantage is that we don't need to get approval from Stone Family Foundation or from USAID if we need to pivot strategies. If we say, you know what, we need to do some surge hiring in this province because it's lagging behind. I've worked for organizations or with funders where it took more time to get the approval than, it was too late to implement those changes. So from an implementer side, this provides tremendous flexibility for us to make those choices and how to spend the money to be able to deliver the results. And we have those kind of performance-based incentives with our team on the ground. So I think the transaction cost for a World Bank or a Stone Family Foundation to sign those kinds of contracts at the pit end tier level, it's probably, the transaction costs are going to be too high. And, how are they going to monitor that? So I think that's where working with an NGO that is able to have those connections and make sure that the results are achieved is what makes it work. So I don't know if I had my question was for Miguel.
Great. Anything to add to what Sarah said?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating question. And unfortunately, we haven't seen as much of that government passing on the risk to the private contractor. And there's two reasons. One is because the procurement laws within the country restrain the public institutions to do public finances. But the second part, the more optimistic, is that in autonomous entities, such as utilities, sometimes utilities are regulated for a different procurement law, procurement mechanism. They have more leeway in the way they contract. So we've seen the typical utility contracting, the DBO for the wastewater treatment plant. So they pay by DBO remove, amount of wastewater treated. So this is I think the next frontier now for performance-based financing. How can we influence the whole public procurement of the countries to be able to function in the same way? But there's the challenges of that. Obviously, to have this mechanism, you have to understand what is the input and what is the output and the cost of each, so you can properly price it. So that's not well understood for on-site sanitation. How much is the collection of each one of the septic latrines to avoid precisely the issues of corruption. So until there's enough of a database of monitoring and evaluation to be able to structure these contracts, the question mark of is there corruption, is leakage of public funds always going to be there? So that's one of the challenges. But I think as the sector progresses on implementing this type of projects, there'll be more information to be able to structure that type of contracts.
And just merge the two questions like slightly, and that, I mean, what we would actually love would be, say something like a P4R, like a payment for results. I think I got that wrong. Yes, P4, yes. To a utility or a municipality in Kenya that then did contract us as Sanergy on a results basis. And I think, and I hear you that there are challenges on the procurement process and like the way that contracts can be structured. But I think that indeed then, we could take on, I would want to take on that risk and that accountability. But I agree that's much more difficult to both from a transaction cost perspective and from a risk and pricing perspective for a smaller organization or SME that doesn't have that kind of data or ability to withstand some of the implementation risks that would go with it.
So we are on time. Well, we are actually beyond time. Thanks for staying. And as I gave an airline analogy, we are always late, airline. So thanks for extending your journey with us.